Chapter 10, Work. When the following Monday, after a lapse of 13 months, Hilda Thorson stood within half a block of the 4-story structure occupied by the Alaska Knitting Works, her heart sank within her. The sight of the familiar gray walls and small paned windows startled her as if from a deep sleep. Where was she going? What was she doing? It had rained incessantly the Saturday and Sunday after she had left the employ of the Jarvis restaurant, and in the 2 dreary days she had spent in the tenement alone with her thoughts, she decided to go back to the knitting factory, the only place she had known and worked in New York. It at least had the merit of being familiar. As she stood within sight of it, however, the factory dropped the halo which she had cast over it in those 2 lonely days, and with vivid painfulness, Hilda recalled the dungeon-like qualities of the establishment. The Alaska Knitting Works was located on the edge of the East River in a building that had been erected at the time of the Civil War. While many similar structures in its vicinity had long ago yielded up their ghosts under the hammers of the wrecking crew, making way for steamship piers, huge warehouses, and gigantic oil tanks, the Alaska building maintained itself. With hardly any alterations or changes, it managed to adapt itself to the drive of present-day machinery and thus continued to justify its existence. The street in front of it bustled with life. Big automobile trucks hurried to and from the piers. Seamen, longshoremen, day laborers of every description were coming and going in a steady stream. A number of men had stopped to look at the young woman who was standing on the sidewalk, staring intently ahead. But Hilda did not notice them. She was oblivious of everyone and everything about her. She was gazing at the factory and thinking of the work, the hours in it. They began the day at the Alaska Knitting Works at 7 in the morning. There was half an hour for lunch, and then it was work again until 5:30 in the evening, when the 10-hour day was at an end. She recalled vividly what a nightmare this having to be at the factory at 7 sharp was to her. If they had only made it 7:30, she had often wished. What a difference that half hour would have made. One could do up one's hair properly and eat a half-decent breakfast. The half hour would make an even greater difference now that she had a child. No, the knitting factory was out of the question for her now. She could not possibly go back to it again. She started away from it, but changed her mind. She was there in front of the factory already. Hadn't she better go through with her program and let there be no more illusions? She would go in and see what work, what wages they would offer her. In front of the familiar side door, she hesitated an instant and then quickly walked up the flight of stairs to the office. The name of the foreman she had worked for, Sheeb, came to her. She asked for Mr. Sheeb. The foreman did not recognize her at once. When she had exchanged a few words with him and refreshed his memory, he recalled her. He gazed at her with an expression of surprise. "You wish to come back to work here?" he repeated, thinking that perhaps he had not caught the drift of Hilda's talk. The usual course for a girl who once left the Alaska Knitting Works was never to show her face again there. Hilda nodded assent. "And you have a baby now?" That too, she affirmed. She had a year-old baby. The foreman was a Swiss by birth. He was exacting with his employees. It was his business to be so. But he was also human. Hilda seemed troubled and bewildered. The fact that she came to him when she was troubled and that she remembered his name both touched and flattered him. "What seems to be the matter with restaurant work?" he asked, and there was a note of fellowship in his voice which stirred Hilda deeply. Since her break with the Whites and with Mrs. Bassick, no one had talked to her that way. She was about to tell him what her objections to the waitress job were, but checked herself in time. After all, the foreman was a stranger to her. Besides, he was a busy man. That was not the time for long conversations. She sighed. Mr. Sheeb knew something of life and of the city. He gave more than one interpretation to her sigh. "You are not broke?" he asked a bit anxiously. She assured him she was not broke. "Well," he said with an air of relief, "if you really want to work here, I'll give you a job. But, frankly, I don't think this is the place for you now. You have a child, and you are likely to need work for some years to come. Why not get into an occupation that has a future? There's no future in this." The door leading into the factory opened and a face peered in. The foreman was wanted inside. "All right," Mr. Sheeb said over his shoulder. "I'll be there directly." Turning to Hilda, he continued speaking rapidly. "Why don't you try the clothing trades? Waists, dresses. Several girls have left here recently to go into the clothing trades." She said something about having to start as a beginner there and not being paid while learning. "That is only a matter of weeks," the foreman said deprecatingly. "It isn't a loss, but an investment, and you'll get further in the end by making this investment." There was another call from the factory. "If you cannot get located," Mr. Sheeb spoke, holding the door to the factory half open so that Hilda got a glimpse of the familiar workroom and heard the clank of the machinery, "come back and I'll find something for you." In the street again, Hilda felt as if a great weight had rolled off her shoulders. Her venture into the past was ended, happily ended. The conversation with the foreman had sent a flood of courage coursing through her veins. Mr. Sheeb had talked to her as to an equal. He respected her, had faith in her. The world apparently was not worrying about her past. If she too could only forget it. She recalled that she had not even thanked him for his kind words and was sorry. After she had gone some distance, she stopped and looked back upon the gray structure. She felt that she was seeing it for the last time. It was going out of her life, and with it a large part of the past was swimming out of her horizon. She recalled the day in October shortly after her arrival from Chicago when she first came to this building. A cold, drizzly rain was falling, and her thoughts were as cheerless as the weather. She had spent 7 months at the factory. It seemed almost incredible that she and the Hilda of those 7 months were one and the same. She had been so afraid then. She was not afraid now, not in the least afraid. She had a child, and she had not become an outcast. She had not become a Pearl Whitney, a pariah for everyone to trample underfoot. And she never would. There was no reason for it. She was not in Stillwell. She was in New York. An elevated train became visible in the distance, and her eye followed it gratefully until the string of cars was lost to view. There was so much security in the vast distances the train covered, in the millions of people it scattered in the morning and gathered together in the evening. security for herself, for her child. She had reached the elevated structure at 3rd Avenue and 23rd Street and was thinking where to go next. She had some addresses of factories which advertised for help that morning, but there was no use going there at least for an hour. It was dinner time. After the rain of the preceding 2 days, a warm sun had come out and was imparting a cheerfulness to everything it touched. The tenements seemed to relax their stern, gloomy aspect. Aged gray men and women were coming out of these tenements and strolling up and down the street, warming their bent backs and rheumatic joints. From a factory, a swarm of girls were dropped to the sidewalk by an elevator, and they stood there, basking in the sun and chatting gleefully. Babies were toddling on the sidewalk while their mothers kept a sharp lookout for them. Hilda thought of her child. They were probably giving him his dinner at the nursery now, and then they would undress him and put him in his bed for a nap. He would whimper a little. He always did when they put him to sleep. As she stood reflecting, an Italian carrying a huge basket of lilacs ran plumb into her. Before she recovered from the impact, the man had disappeared, but the fragrance of the lilacs lingered. She became poignantly aware that it was spring. Spring! The lilac trees were blooming. The fields were green. She was swayed by a strange gentleness. With her new job, whatever that proved to be, there was a long workday in store for herself, a long day for her child. It would mean 9 to 10 hours for her in the factory, 10 to 11 hours for the child in the nursery. A sudden resolution flashed upon her. The afternoon would most likely be wasted anyway. The morning was the only real time to look for work. Why not devote the afternoon to the babe? She would take him to Central Park. She would surprise him. If she hurried, she would still find him awake. She ran up the stairs to the elevated train with a zest and exuberance which was a surprise even to herself. She had not felt so light-hearted in nearly 2 years. She was wondering whether she ought not to reproach herself for such levity, but the thought of reproach was short-lived. Her blood was hot, and the wind from the East River and beyond, it was cool. It seemed to her there was a fragrance of lilac in the breeze. She did not go into the car, but remained standing on the platform. A tune she and Raymond were very fond of 2 summers earlier, and which they had often hummed together on their walks, was welling up in her throat. Into her eyes a wistful look came, and a tender pain began to steal into her heart. 16, 17, 18. There were several more stories to the building, but Hilda, standing on the curb across the street from it, counted no more. Neither in Chicago nor in New York had she ever worked in a skyscraper before. She was quite awed and was about to pass on and to look for the next place on the list of advertisements she had marked that morning. But she did not. She held counsel with herself. A stream of people was coming in and out of the skyscraper. The brass plates on either side of the entrance announced the various shops and factories which had their location in the building. The likelihood was, she reasoned with herself, that the other factories on her list were located in buildings that were just as tall. If she had meant to find work in the clothing trades, she had better make up her mind to submit to the conditions in the trade. She entered the building. "On the 11th floor, ma'am. The Negro elevator man informed her when she inquired for the Princess Waist and Dress Company. She did not resemble the girls who came in search of jobs, and he was polite and attentive. The elevator opened directly into an office. There were rugs on the floor, green, plush. In the center of the room was a mahogany table with chairs to match. To one side, behind a glass partition, a girl sat at a desk typing. Through a half-open door, Hilda caught a glimpse of another room with glass showcases which displayed a variety of waists and dresses. There, girls in clinging skirts, high-heeled shoes, and elaborate coiffures idled about chairs and lounges. It was the company's showroom, and buyers did not begin to come until a little before 11. The girl who was sitting at the typewriter inside the glass partition came out and, smiling pleasantly, asked what she could do for her. Hilda held out the advertisement in the morning paper calling for help. The smile on the girl's face instantly changed to a grimace. "The factory is on the floor below. This is the office," she spoke with an injured air. "You should have told the elevator man you were looking for work." Hilda apologized for the mistake. "No harm." The girl was now showing her magnanimity. "Just walk down a flight of stairs, this way, yes, and enter the door on your left." Before the door on the left had had time to close behind Hilda's back, an office boy with curly black hair and quick, darting eyes was at her side. Would she sit down on one of the benches? Mrs. Walsh would be out directly. He gave her no chance to say anything about the advertisement, about work. He knew that she wanted work. Only those looking for work came through that door. Mrs. Walsh was a woman of 40. She was not the typical forelady. She was not round of figure. Her complexion was not florid. On the contrary, she was rather thin and had soft and delicate features. She used no powder, and her gaze was like that of a man, businesslike. She surveyed Hilda with a feeling of surprise and curiosity. "How did you come here?" she snapped, and smiled at her own impulsiveness. She had not intended to ask the question, but it slipped her tongue. Hilda explained that she had come in response to the advertisement in the morning paper. The four ladies' smile deepened. It was not this she had meant with her question. In the several years which she had been connected with the Princess Waist Company, Mrs. Walsh had been accustomed to deal with Jewish, Italian, Bohemian girls. Never yet in all her experience had an American girl applied for the work Hilda was applying for. Not office work, not being a model, but common work at the machine. And Hilda was unmistakably American, an American of the Middle West country, which Mrs. Walsh had known in other days. "You've never worked in the clothing trades before?" She was making sure of her diagnosis. Hilda told her that her experience in factory work was limited to the knitting trade. Looking frankly at Mrs. Walsh, she added, "I'm told that there's a future in the clothing trade, and I should like to get into it. I am self-supporting and have a child to look after. I want to get into something that is steady." "Oh," was all the comment the forelady made. Her face became serious. She had a consumptive husband whose life she was trying to save by keeping him in a sanitarium. Her two little girls were staying with her husband's parents in Connecticut so that she could spend every cent she saved on their father. She understood Hilda's desire for steady work. Mrs. Walsh was not in the habit of taking much time with the help she hired. It was yes or no, rather briefly. But this was a different matter. Hilda was her kind. She was of her class. She was an American and a Christian. It made a difference. She was thinking. Finally, she outlined the nature of the work to her. The clothing industry had an undoubted future. This, however, was not saying that every worker in it had a future. Still, it was not a bad trade. There were plenty of shops, and work was not hard to find. After the rebuff by the office girl on the floor above, and the uncanny and wordless reception by the curly-headed office boy, Mrs. Walsh's words and presence felt like home to Hilda. She decided to cast her lot with her with the Princess Waist Company. The forelady showed Hilda where to hang her clothes. As an afterthought, she added, "I'll do the best I can for you. We don't, as a rule, pay learners, but I shall see if we can't pay you something from the start." From the dressing room, the door led into the factory. The impression which Hilda got of the place was that of a huge cobweb. From wall to wall, from floor to ceiling, the loft seemed one tangle of lingerie, silk, voiles, paper patterns. There were long lines of machines, and bending over these machines and manipulating them were heads, shoulders, arms. The faces of the workers were buried in the cloth. The odor of fresh materials mixed with the odor of machine oil and human sweat. Mrs. Walsh's eyes, which had been gliding over the lanes of machines, finally lighted upon the subject sought, a middle-aged Italian woman. Because of the noise from the machines, Hilda could not hear the conversation between the forelady and the woman. In a few moments, everything was settled between them. Hilda and the Italian woman were introduced to each other. The woman was to teach her the trade. Half an hour was gone before Hilda was able to thread the machine herself. With that achieved, she was shown how to set it in operation by pressing her foot down on the pedal, and how to stop it by lifting her foot. Somewhere between these two processes lay varying degrees of speed, whose regulation she would learn little by little. In an hour, she was sewing straight seams, which, however, did not always come out very straight, because her brain seemed too much concerned with the manipulations of her foot on the pedal. Finally, she seemed to be taking hold of things. But just as she was getting herself set and ready for the making of straight seams, the power was turned off. It was noon. All work ceased. The shop assumed a new aspect. The noise from the machines stopped, and in its place there arose a human buzzing. The girls, and here and there a man, were losing no time in getting to their lunch or in getting out of the place. Hilda was caught in the stream. There was chatter all about her in Yiddish, Italian, Bohemian. They had 45 minutes for lunch. Many of the girls went down for their meals to restaurants, and the elevator was jammed. When she was in the street, Hilda stood still for some moments, trying to puzzle out her own thoughts and sensations. "Aren't you acquainted hereabouts?" a young woman smilingly asked her. "If you aren't, come with me. There's a nice restaurant around the corner." Hilda had seen the young woman in the shop. They were facing each other across 2 rows of machines, and the young woman had been gazing at her not unpleasantly all morning. She went with her. "This is your first day in the shop?" her new acquaintance remarked. "Yes, I'm altogether new in the trade," Hilda answered. "There's not much to learn. In 3 or 4 weeks, you will be doing as well as any of us. It's largely a matter of speed," the former said cheerfully. "I suppose," the young woman smiled at Hilda, "you were wondering what I was staring at you for all morning. I hope you'll forgive me, but it seemed to me you were British, and I was curious. I came from London myself." Hilda said she was American. When they were near the restaurant, the other spoke up, blinking with faint embarrassment. "We're not introduced yet, are we? My name is Mrs. Breen, Ada Breen. Mrs. Thorson is my name." They looked each other over again. Each was wondering what brought the other to the factory, and each decided that she would like the other. By 3 o'clock, Hilda had lost hope of ever getting used to the machine, to the work. Her neck and shoulders ached, and she moved her arms with difficulty. Her right foot was numbed by the vibrations of the electric motor. As the afternoon wore on, the pain extended downwards from her shoulders to the small of her back. She began to think that perhaps, after all, the clothing trade was an occupation only foreigners could work in. Maybe their constitutions were different. She was apparently only wasting her time there. Yes, she was wasting her time. Her brain was hazy, and she was keeping at her work mechanically. For some time she wondered whether she had not better stop there and then and explain the situation to Mrs. Walsh, whom she had seen flitting about the floor. Her thoughts went back to the restaurant, not the Jarvis place, but to the other place on 4th Avenue, the one that had had the typewriter upon which she typed the bills of fare. She was thinking that she had not been just to the restaurant business. She had come into it with an antipathy and was only looking at the dark side of things. Of course, the Jarvis was no place for her. But there must be family restaurants in New York where things were different than at the Jarvis. Yes, she would have to look for such a family restaurant. Her experiment at the waste shop was a failure, an all-around failure. It was in the midst of such musings that Mrs. Walsh found her just before closing time. The forelady picked up the pieces of material Hilda had been sewing and examined them critically. Hilda stood aside indifferently. It was all the same to her now. Her experiment in the shop was over. "You are doing pretty well," the forelady said with a gaze of satisfaction. Hilda heard her words only distantly. There was a fixed, far-away look in her eyes. She was still thinking of the restaurant. Mrs. Walsh looked puzzled. A glint of suspicion came into her eyes. Had she wasted her time on the girl for nothing? "Will you be coming back in the morning?" she asked. Hilda took a sudden drop to reality. "Oh, yes," she said hastily. "Yes." The day at the machine had cast a perceptible paleness over her features. Her face was decidedly thinner. As soon as she stepped out of the loft building and was in the street again, she forgot her aches and pains and started for the elevator at a rush. There was quite a walk to the nearest station, and there was an even greater distance from the end of her elevated journey to the day nursery where the child was waiting for her. The train, as was usual at that hour, was crowded to the brim with tired, irritated men and women on their way home from work. A mixed odor of garlic, sweat, and powder cut her breath short. but she kept on wedging and sidling her way until she reached an open window. There she remained standing, determined not to be dislodged. From the window she commanded a view of the endless string of tenement houses, which were swiftly receding behind the onrushing train. Her thoughts were fixed on the stations. It was 6:15 when, flushed from the rapid walk, Hilda finally entered the nursery. The official day at the nursery ended at 5:30. Below in the hall, however, there was a wide bench upon which the children whose mothers could not call for them till 6 or a little later were seated, dressed and ready to be taken away by the parent. Hilda was the last to come, and little Raymond was sitting on the bench alone. A rubber doll lay near him, but he paid no attention to it. He sat moping, his chin bowed to his breast. Catching sight of his mother, his sullenness disappeared. He started to smile, but on the way, the smile metamorphosed into a twitching of the lips. He was crying like one hurt, offended. She kissed his tears away, drove the frowns from the little face, and started home at a run, as if the ground were burning under her feet. She was wet with perspiration, her clothes were wilted, and for the first time in the months she had been living alone, Hilda now appreciated the privacy of her little flat. She drew the half curtain across the window, and standing before the sink, naked from her waist up, she let the cold water run over her arms, her neck. As she washed, she was talking to the child, and little Raymond enjoyed hugely the sight of his mother's face brimming at him through soap suds. In a few minutes, she had her half-pound of steak broiling on the fire and potatoes frying in the pan alongside of it. She did not sit down to eat, however, until after the child had been fed and was sitting in his high chair, smiling contentedly. After the day at the machine, her body was crying out for a walk. The child, too, had been kept in longer than usual. She cleared the table quickly, and they were soon in the street and heading in the direction of the river. The East River was her favorite retreat. It was bound up with her New York life and experiences. She had got her first room within a few minutes' walk from it. The Alaska Knitting Works, where she found her first job, was on the river's edge. The hospital, where she had given birth, was near it. Her little home and the day nursery were each within a block of it. The long day had left her a short evening, and by the time she got to it, the river was shrouded in darkness. The child had fallen asleep in the carriage, and, undisturbed, she stood there a long time, following the misty trail of passing boats and barges. Blackwell's Island lay before her, its lights twinkling dimly in the fog-like atmosphere. Hilda was speculating about the people on the island, the sick in the hospitals, the aged in the homes, the criminal. Sad thoughts were stirring within her. When she was home again and was undressing the child, he opened his eyes and gazed at his mother with uneasiness. "No, my sonny," Hilda interpreted his look and answered it. "Mama isn't going away. She is going to stay right here with her baby." The questioning gaze vanished, and smiling little Raymond fell asleep again. She rounded out the hour until 10 with housework. She was tired but not sleepy. The day's events and impressions were running through her thoughts. A sense of incompleteness came over her, a feeling of something missing. After a little, she traced that feeling. She had not seen enough of her baby that day. She had not had enough time. The time for her child, for herself, had become so limited. That cannot go on this way, she mused painfully. She must have more time. Such an existence would soon deaden her. She must not become a drudge. She would make every effort not to become one. Her gaze fell upon the trunk in the corner of the room. It was a new acquisition. She had bought it together with the furniture on the installment plan. There were several books in the trunk, books Raymond had given her, bought for her. She had always meant to read those books. She had often wanted to take them out and had even bought a small willow bookcase along with her furniture to keep the books in. But she had never been quite in the mood to unpack the trunk. It was like reading old letters, stirring up old memories. The mood was upon her now. Her very tiredness seemed to provoke it. She unlocked the trunk and rummaged through it quickly. There was a small, carefully wrapped up package of family heirlooms, some of her mother's beads and a brooch, her parents' wedding certificate, and her father's naturalization papers. There was also an iron ring her father had worn all his life, and which he had given her with feigned playfulness shortly before he died. The ring, he had said, was lucky. The books lay at the bottom of the trunk, and she produced them one by one. The Light That Failed by Kipling. Jack London's The Call of the Wild. She had read them both. In both of them, Raymond had his name. Over the next book, she meditated. It was Eli's French and German Socialism. Raymond had studied this book in his class in economics at the university. He had meant to read it to her the following winter. He wanted her to know, he had said, some of the problems that were stirring people the world over, but he had never read it to her. There was no following winter in their relations. She had heard a good deal about socialism since, however. The police were constantly breaking up meetings and parades of socialists. There was so much in the newspapers about it. Last came a small booklet with yellow covers. It was called Golden Treasury and was an anthology of English poetry. Raymond had used the book in his class in sophomore English, and because of its handy pocket size, it was his companion on many of his excursions with Hilda that summer. On the flyleaf was the inscription, "To Hilda from Raymond." It was the only tangible memory she had of him. She took the book of poems to bed with her and slowly turned its pages. Many of them were marked. Here and there, lines were underscored. As she perused these lines by the dim light of the gas jet, she was recalling the places and the occasions on which Raymond had read and declaimed them to her. In spite of her weariness, she did not fall asleep until very late.